Ukrainians react to the assassination attempt on former U.S. President Donald Trump.
Most of people in Ukraine saying that this is something that should not be a part of politics, should not be a part of the modern way of doing things.
Plus, days after NATO allies called Beijing a Ukraine war enabler, China and Russia begin joint naval drills.
China's state TV said the drills are aimed at demonstrating the capabilities of the navies in addressing security threats and preserving peace and stability.
And later in the program, Ukrainians are much less eager to sign up to fight against Russian forces than they were in the early days of the war. Today is Monday, July 15th. From the Voice of America, this is Flashpoint Ukraine. Good evening, I'm Lori London. The world continues to react to the attempted assassination of former U.S. President Donald Trump. Anna Chernikova in Kyiv joins us now with reaction from Ukraine.
Well, actually, it was quite a shocking news coming from the U.S., of course, and for Ukrainian people who live in a state of war with violence every day, it was very, touching, and people were definitely not happy about what's happening. People condemned this attack. Most of people in Ukraine saying that this is something that should not be a part of politics, should not be a part of the modern way of doing things. Most of people expressed their words of support for Donald Trump for his fast recovery and ability to continue his work and his campaign. Also, President Zelenskyy expressed his words of support to Donald Trump right after the attack when this information came in. He said that he is definitely against such acts of violence, and this is unacceptable to be a part of the modern politics, of the modern life. President Zelenskyy also said that he wishes President Donald Trump a fast recovery.
Just a quick follow-up on that horrific attack in Kyiv last week, which hit a children's hospital and was just so tragic, and you were on scene at the time. Are there any updates?
Yeah, actually, unfortunately, 2 children died as a result of that attack. They were in a serious condition at the moment of the attack in that hospital, and in a couple of days after the attack, it was confirmed that they did not survive. So the number of victims increased, and unfortunately, these are children who added the list of victims. So yeah, at this point, this is what we have. The recovery and the rebuilding of the hospital has already begun. A critical infrastructure was restored, and Ukrainians collected donations of more than $7 million to support this hospital, just regular Ukrainians, and a lot of other international and Ukrainian organizations will join. So everyone is expecting here that rebuilding of this hospital will begin soon.
Well, that's good news for sure. And I understand you've learned some interesting insights into Ukraine's population since the war started, since Russia's full-scale invasion.
Every day we're getting news about young people dying in Ukraine, children, young men and women, and of course this is a very painful topic for Ukrainian society. In its recent research, UN predicted that until 2100, Ukrainian population will decrease to 15 million people. At this point, just for understanding, Ukrainian population is 37 million people, and this number is almost twice less than what Ukrainians have today. Ukrainian Institute of Demographics said that, well, this is quite a pessimistic prognosis. However, the Institute also has a short-term prediction which demonstrates that a decrease might go to something like 30 million, not 15.
And Monday's an important date for Ukraine in general. Tell us about the significance.
Yeah, so July 15th in Ukraine is the Day of Ukrainian Statehood. Is quite a fresh holiday in Ukraine, and very important considering the full-scale invasion and considering that Ukrainian nation. Ukrainian soldiers are fighting for this statehood every day. President Zelenskyy made an address, a speech to the nation, saying how he's thankful to the society, to the soldiers for protecting Ukraine, for preserving the statehood, and that Ukrainian nation will never give up its statehood. And also on this day, this holiday also shares another holiday of the baptism of Kyiv, of Kyiv Rus back in the time. And basically, these are two very important events that happen in the Ukrainian history. So baptism of the country of Kyiv Rus and Ukrainian statehood goes in line together on the same day. So Ukrainians do not really celebrate in the situation of full-scale invasion, but it's an important day to mark and remember what Ukrainians are fighting for.
Anna Chernikova reporting from Kyiv. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lori.
NATO allies last week pledged to support Ukraine on an irreversible path to integration while calling on China to cease all support for Russia's war effort against Kyiv. This as new fighter jets are set to patrol the skies of Ukraine. VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb has details.
American-made F-16 fighter jets now heading to Ukraine from NATO allies Denmark and the Netherlands. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin.
The transfer of F-16s is officially underway, and Ukraine will be flying F-16s this summer.
All 32 allies in a communique calling Ukraine's path to NATO membership, quote, irreversible, in a strong message to Russian President Vladimir Putin that he simply cannot wait out NATO allies. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg.
The work we are doing together now will ensure that when the time is right, Ukraine can join without delay. It is not a question of if, but when.
U.S. President Joe Biden pressed NATO allies to continue their increased defense spending in order to keep up with Russia's wartime production levels.
They're significantly ramping up their production of weapons, munitions, and vehicles. And they're doing it with the help of China, North Korea, and Iran. We cannot, in my view, we cannot allow the alliance to fall behind.
The alliance also calling on China to cease its support of Russia's war machine, saying it cannot enable the largest war in Europe in nearly 80 years without negatively impacting its interest and reputation. Again, NATO's Stoltenberg.
The declaration we have agreed today is the strongest message NATO allies have ever sent on China's contributions to Russia's illegal war against Ukraine.
Analyst and veteran Brad Bowman.
They're providing dual-use technology and support to Russia's defense industrial base, enabling Putin's war of aggression in Ukraine and allowing him to fight longer and to replace his losses.
Analyst and veteran Brad Bowman tells VOA that calling out China was long overdue for the 32-member bloc.
Europeans are dying in Europe in a war of aggression from the Kremlin with the support of Iran, North Korea, and China, period.
Non-NATO partners from the Indo-Pacific joined NATO allies for the summit in Washington this week. Officials say attendance by Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand sends a message to China that democratic alliances will stand up for the rule of law, no matter where an aggressor tries to break it. Carla Babb, VOA News, Washington.
And days after NATO allies called Beijing a Ukraine war enabler, China and Russia have begun joint naval drills. We hear more from Associated Press correspondent Karen Shamus.
The Chinese Defense Ministry said in a brief statement that the operation had nothing to do with international and regional situations and didn't target any third party. The joint drills, which began in Guangdong province, are expected to last until mid-July. China's state TV said the drills are aimed at demonstrating the capabilities of the navies in addressing security threats and preserving peace and stability globally and regionally. I'm Karen Shamas.
With the recent escalation of massive Russian missile attacks on Ukraine and an announcement that it's resuming production of long-range missiles, Moscow is raising pressure on NATO allies. Marcus Harton narrates this report by Ricardo Marquina.
A day before NATO leaders met in Washington to mark the 75th anniversary of the Atlantic Alliance, Russia launched a massive attack on Ukraine, including its capital, in broad daylight. Russian forces used medium-range missiles, the same type that Moscow has announced it plans to resume manufacturing, and which could be outfitted with nuclear warheads. Resuming production of this type of missile enables Moscow to continue its strikes on central and western Ukraine. The announcement came as Russia said the United States was producing missile systems and shipping them to Denmark and the Philippines, while pushing for NATO expansion last year with the additions of Sweden and Finland. Jacob Karsbo is a security policy analyst at think tank Europa in Copenhagen.
I think Russia would have done it regardless of the NATO enlargement. I think Russia is in need of these types of missiles also in Ukraine. So I don't subscribe to the idea that this is something that has just come up due to NATO enlargement, etc. But obviously, Putin and the Kremlin, they want to give this impression that NATO enlargement is the cause of all this.
The Kremlin routinely accuses Western nations of escalating tensions by supplying anti-aircraft systems, tanks, and fighter jets to Ukraine. But some warn Moscow's latest threats to boost its missile capabilities should not be taken lightly. Mark Hanna, Senior Fellow at the Institute for Global Affairs in New York.
The threats that Putin is making about the use of nuclear weapons are not to be trivialized, right? These aren't something that any responsible observer or analyst of national security can set aside. It is likely, or it is plausible that a very desperate Putin might use some of his tactical nuclear arsenal.
Russia has not achieved the quick, clear-cut victory it hoped for when it invaded Ukraine in 2022, and it is still unclear which side will win what has become a war of attrition at a high cost in lives. Observers say this scenario has Moscow looking to more drastic and desperate measures in hopes of pressuring Western nations to cut their support for Ukraine. For Ricardo Marquina, Marcus Harton, VOA News.
At a recent summit between India and Russia, both countries said they were committed to deepening their relationship. Anjana Pashrika reports on why India is enhancing its partnership with Russia, which has been isolated by Western countries over its war in Ukraine.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's conferment of his country's highest civilian honor on Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi at a recent summit in Moscow showcased the commitment made by the two leaders to enhance their ties. Indian Prime Minister Modi told Putin that the foundation you set for a strategic relationship between the two countries has become stronger and blossomed over time. India's effort to keep ties on track is driven partly by the decades-old dependence of the world's second-largest military on Russian weapons. Harsh Pant is Vice President for Studies at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi.
Despite attempts at diversification, India still remains very much a country that is in thrall of Russian weaponry, Russian technology, Russian weapon systems pose a legacy issue as far as India's defense policy is concerned, and it's unlikely to change anytime soon. So I think India will have to continue to keep Russia in good humor.
New Delhi, which has not joined Western countries in isolating Russia for its invasion of Ukraine, pledged to increase bilateral trade to $100 billion by 2030. New Delhi also does not want to isolate Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine, due to fears that Russia's growing ties with China pose a geostrategic challenge to India as its border confrontation with Beijing persists, Pant said.
Russia and China, of course, have taken their relationship to another level. And I think there are concerns in India that if this relationship continues, it might significantly alter India's national security calculus. And that's something that India certainly does not want to happen.
India has not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But in Moscow, Modi urged a resolution through dialogue, calling the deaths of children heart-wrenching. Modi said it is not possible to find solutions on the battlefield. He said that peace talks cannot succeed amid bombs, guns, and bullets. The remarks were seen as an effort to balance India's failure to join the United States in criticizing the conflict. Washington's partnership is also critical for India, according to Sankalp Gurjar at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics.
US is also a major partner when it comes to technology, with trade, defense, everything. Same with Russia. So I think India needs both.
Following the summit, White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said at a press briefing that all countries, including India, must support efforts to realize peace in Ukraine.
So we also believe India's long-standing relationship with Russia gives it the ability to urge the President Putin, to end his brutal war, an unprovoked war in Ukraine.
There is growing understanding in Western countries of why India is nurturing ties with Russia. Pant again.
The criticism from the West has also been more measured, understanding the imperative that India, at the end of the day, is also looking at the Russia relationship through the China lens and not simply through the lens of the Russia-Western conflict.
However, balancing ties between the United States and Russia could become more challenging if the Ukraine conflict drags on. Anjana Pasricha, VOA News, New Delhi.
Відповідні договори, там все. Від грошей до зброї.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy said Monday he's aiming to have all the elements of a peace plan ready in November so that Kyiv can convene a second follow-up international summit on his vision for peace. Ukraine held a first summit in Switzerland last month that was attended by representatives of 92 countries, but not Russia. Kyiv has said it could invite representatives from Russia to the next one. You're listening to VOA's Flashpoint Ukraine. I'm Lori London. Last week's Russian missile attacks that hit Kyiv's largest children's hospital and some residential buildings were just decimated. Anna Kostachenko spoke with residents who were allowed to briefly go back to collect some personal belongings and has this report.
Vera Sokolova was renting an apartment in Kyiv with her two teenage children and her mother. On Monday, July 8th, their entire apartment complex was damaged in a Russian missile attack on Ukraine. Sokolova, who is a nurse, was at work during the attack, and her kids and mother were home.
Shelling started and we headed to the shelter. Then my son called and said, "Mom, a rocket hit our house. The apartment is on fire, we're suffocating, and the doors are blocked."
They got out safely, but it's not the first time Sokolova and her family's home had been shelled by Russia since the invasion. A Mariupol native, she saw her home there destroyed when Russian forces occupied the city in early 2022. She moved to Kyiv to be safer, but today Sokolova doesn't have a home again. She also left most of her belongings, she says.
All is destroyed or damaged, even the children's laptop and tablet.
Another resident of the damaged Kyiv apartment building, Andriy Krivolapov, was at home when the shelling started. The blast wave broke the windows in his apartment and on the balcony, he says. He got a contusion and shrapnel injuries on his face and legs.
I wanted to watch the news when I heard a siren. I also looked out the window and saw a white trace from a rocket. So I sat down on the couch, and then it hit the building. Everything happened so quickly, and then the paramedics and firefighters started arriving.
Next door to Krivolapov is Alla Zgoda, who lives in an apartment with her husband and her two sons. Their apartment burned along with everything inside. Zgoda and her family were at home when the shelling started, and they quickly left, abandoning all their things.
My purse with all the documents was in the hallway. We were in such shock. We thought we would come back later and grab some belongings.
Russia's missile attack also destroyed a wing of Kyiv's Ahmadit Children's Hospital, a private medical center on the left bank of the Dnieper River, and residential buildings in several areas of the city. According to the Ukrainian government, at least 43 people have been killed and over 170 have been injured. Anna Kostychenko, VOA News, Kyiv, Ukraine.
On draft patrol in Kyiv, a combat veteran says Ukrainians are less eager to fight than they were early in the war against Russian forces. The draft officer is on the front line of an effort to increase conscription despite waning public enthusiasm. Lucy Fielder with Reuters reports.
We don't use force, we don't twist anyone's arm or force them into minivans. We're against these methods. I'm against them.
This combat veteran, who goes by the call sign Fantomas, is waging a different kind of battle on the streets of Kyiv to replenish troop numbers. He says men are less eager to fight than before, 28 months after Russia's invasion. There's a queue outside the local draft office, but men under 60 now have to register or renew their personal data at draft offices or online by July 16th. And draft officials say they've struggled with a sudden influx.
People used to wait for weeks to get the chance to join the army. Now, as far as I know, most of the queues are people who want to obtain some sort of exemption.
Reuters accompanied the draft officer on a recent patrol. As he handed out call-up papers, one man slipped into a nearby store and another refused to stop. Others quietly obliged. President Volodymyr Zelenskiy lowered the draft age to 25 from 27 in April and overhauled the mobilization process. And there are signs the drive is working. Recruitment numbers are shrouded in wartime secrecy, but the Ukrainian military told Reuters in a statement conscription more than doubled in May and June compared to the previous 2 months. Without providing figures, many weary troops are desperate to be replaced after more than 2 years of almost non-stop service.
You're needed. Replace us. There are those who react positively. I'd say up to 70% of the time. I don't even have to explain anything to them. They understand that nobody else will do this except for themselves. Nobody else.
In an April survey commissioned by a state broadcaster, about half of Ukrainians thought mobilization was going poorly, and 60% had a negative view of draft offices. Though strengthened by long-delayed Western aid, Ukraine's forces have struggled for months to hold the line against Russian troops, who are inching forward in the east.
That was Lucy Fielders with Reuters. American soldier Jericho McGowan went to fight in Ukraine in March 2022. He was killed in September near Bakhmut. In late June, his body was finally brought back home to California for a funeral. VOA Russian spoke with McGowan's mother and siblings about his life. Anna Rice narrates their story.
When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, American soldier Jericho McGowan signed up to fight for Ukraine the very next month. He was killed in September near Bakhmut, likely by a drone, and his body remained in Ukraine. On June 30th, the day McGowan would have turned 29, his body was finally transported to Los Angeles, and from there to his native town of Ojai, California. His mother, Allison McGowan, said he simply had to go to Ukraine.
And he explained to me that it was like watching bullies on a playground beating up a child, and everyone is standing around, but no one's acting. At that moment, I was like, no, he was going to go no matter what.
His sister, Rebecca McGowan, said his decision puzzled some members of the family.
I never did disagree with that part, but a lot of people, a lot of other family members, my father, my other side of the family, they, a lot of them had questions. What? But this is not his war.
McGowan spent 10 months in Ukraine, then came back to the U.S. His brother, Gideon Yendel, says it was difficult for him to be back.
After the 10 months, he had a little bit of survivor's guilt. He felt like he owed more. He wanted to help and fulfill, and he felt that 10 months wasn't enough. And then he felt like he could go back and still offer more help.
In September, Magellan was about to conduct training for military personnel in Ukraine. Rebecca Magellan says his partner back at home was 5 months pregnant when he was killed.
He was going to be a father, and he was really excited to be a father. Actually, the conversation that I last had with him on the phone was, I'm going out to do this training, it's safe, and then I'm going to come back and that's going to be it. I'm going to be a dad.
Magellan's body wasn't found until 9 months after he was killed. The non-profit R.T. Weatherman Foundation arranged for his body's return to the U.S. Magellan was cremated and buried in Ojai. He leaves behind his family, partner, and the young son he never got to meet. For VOA Russian in Los Angeles, California, Anna Rice, VOA News.
And that'll do it for us today. Stay up to date with continuing coverage on Ukraine and news from around the world 24 hours a day at voanews.com. And on social media, just follow VOA News. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, thank you so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Lori London.